Good evening, everyone. Kalisperasis. Let us begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to their elders, past, present, emerging. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Now, let's return to tonight's seminar by Angela Costi, the Dimitris Daloumas Memorial Seminar. I've lost count, Kathy, which this is the fifth or sixth one because of COVID as well. Our numbering system has gone a bit astray, with the topic being Salvaging Cypriot Greek Migrant Heritage and Memories. This is an annual joint event with the Greek Australian Cultural League, and I'd like to thank Our Books and Hellenic as a sponsor of today's event, and also to thank Helen for some books she's made available for sale at our bookshop, only $5. And we also have Angela's book there as well on sale tonight at a special price. I'll now pass you on to Kathy Alexopoulos to introduce the speaker and the topic. Thank you.
All right. I also too would like to acknowledge the peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land we stand on, and their continuing connection to land, waters and community. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also want to pay my respects to our ancestors who have travelled to this land and have toiled for their survival. Now, as you know, the Dimitris Daloumas lectures have been going for several years, and I'll mention that a little bit later, but I'll just give you a bit breakdown on Dimitris Daloumas. He was born and raised in the island of Leros, Greece. He completed his high school studies at the Lyceum of Rhodes and learnt Italian as a second language. He came to Australia in 1952 for political reasons, having lived through the German occupation and the Civil War in the 40s. He graduated with an arts degree from the University of Melbourne, majoring in English and French, and taught in Australian high schools for over 20 years. His major break in Australia came when a selection of his poems, titled The Observatory, was published in bilingual form, Greek and English, by the University of Queensland Press in 1983. It won the Australian Book Council Award for the Best Book of the Year, a natural progression for Daloumas as an Australian, inverted commas, poet was to write in English, beginning with his first all-English collection, Falcon Drinking, in 1988. 8 more collections followed, with Helen of Troy and Other Poems being his last in 2007. Daloumas won many significant awards for his poetry in Australia, including the Patrick White Award in 1994. He also gained recognition for his work in Greece, England and the US. While more, he has also been published in France, bilingual form, French and Greek. And despite the many awards and recognition of his peers, Daloumas remained a true exile, an outsider. Absence suited him better than exposure, even through absence from language itself. He enjoyed the distance and solitude provided, so that when in Leros he wrote in English, and when in Melbourne he wrote in Greek. He also enjoyed translation and translated or rewrote his own poetry from English into Greek. His very last such translation was his 14-poem sequence, A Winter Journey, published first in English in his collection Helen of Troy and Other Poems, and it was his final gift to poetry. He died in 2016 on his beloved Leros, leaving behind an enormous poetic corpus to be read and studied into the future. And one thing before I continue, I just received a message from his daughter, Martina Dumou, about a forthcoming Greek book about Dimitris Daloumas, which Petros, I don't know this gentleman, but anyway, Fourneris has written. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, yes. So Petros is an author of short stories and plays and an old friend of Dimitri Tsaluma.
Can you say the name again?
Petros Fournaris. No, doesn't say anything. Okay. The book consists of poems and translations of published English articles about Tsaluma. And the purpose is to better inform the Greek public about his English works, because the Greeks really don't know much about Tsaluma. Okay, so we continue. I thought I'd let you know about this because she's going to be sending me the book, Eleni. She spoke to you about this? No. Yeah, this was just a few days ago, Eleni. Yeah. So she's back in Greece now. She comes and goes. His daughter has a child here in Australia, actually in Geelong. Yeah, yeah, and she comes and goes. Okay, after Dimitris' death, in collaboration with Greek community and L Publishing, that's Eleni Nika, and the Greek Australian Culture League, we commenced the Dimitri Tsaluma Memorial Lectures, held as part of a successful and highly informative Greek history and culture seminars. The inaugural lecture was held in 2017 with Rasida Karali. And then in 2018, we had Michael Tsenikas come from South Australia. 2019, Kostadina Dounis, who's here, did another of the lectures. 2020, we had to cancel due to, I won't tell. 2021, Nico Papasteriadi did it online. 2022, Dimitri Troaditi. And of course today, we have Angela Costi. And as mentioned before, her title is Salvaging Cypriot Greek Migrant Heritage and Memories Through the Poetry of Zeny, Giles and Peter Lyssiotis. If you would mind, before you come to the podium, I just want to say a few more words about you. Angela Costi is a poet and a writer with a background in social justice and community arts. She's the author of 5 poetry collections, including Honey and Salt, shortlisted for the Mary Gilmore Poetry Prize 2008, and an embroidery of old maps and new. Is that the book that's there? It's for sale, yeah. Winner of the Book Prize for Poetry in English, which she won in 2022 from the Greek Australian Culture League. She has 9 produced and commissioned plays, performance text, including A Nest of Cinnamon, which was part of an international collaboration funded by the Australian Council of the Arts. In 1995, she received a travel award from the National Languages and Literary Board of Study, Ancient Greek Drama in Greece. She's a graduate of Melbourne University and RMIT. She received the High Commendation for Contribution of Arts to the Arts and Culture, Mary Back Award 2021, and won the Catherine Susanna Pritchard Poetry Prize in 2022 for her poem Swapping One Dysfunctional Family for Another. Thank you very much, Angela. The podium is yours.
Thank you for being here. It's an honour to be delivering my paper as part of the annual commitment to the literary legacy of Dimitris Tsaloumas. And tonight, when I speak of institutionalised archives in my speech, I acknowledge that First Nations peoples were decimated by colonialism. I began writing poetry in the early 1990s and soon realised my Cypriot Greek heritage featured significantly in my poems. So up here you have 2 photos, one of my paternal grandmother and the other one of my maternal grandmother, and notice how similar they are. One woman was based in the north and one in the south. That's most of their children. However, a few of their children are missing because of early death, and some, in a staggered way, they were coming to Australia. And obviously the husbands aren't there because they're in Australia trying to bring them over. I was creatively documenting the oral stories I was bestowed by my Cypriot kin. I was their repository as they came to Australia in the 1950s, some in the 60s and a few in the 70s, with limited education and literacy in Greek, which was the official language of Cyprus. They came to escape poverty, civil unrest and war. Many arrived with British passports as Cyprus was colonised by the British from 1925 to 1960. However, they were not treated in the same way as the arrivals from Britain. Language barriers, cultural differences, financial disadvantage, residues of the White Australia policy contributed to their challenges to live peacefully and well in Sydney and in Melbourne. They had no opportunity to contribute to official histories or archives. In my mother's passport papers, there's a section for eye colour, and there it's recorded that she has chestnut brown eyes. However, her eyes were green. Her papers were stamped by British and Australian officials. Now, this can be perceived as a minor administrative error, or it can be noted as another way of failing to see, and therefore failing to understand the nuanced story of the Cypriot Greek migrant. It is this, the story of the Cypriot migrant, which I fear may be missing from historical and institutionalised archives. For example, in the document titled A History of the Department of Immigration Managing Migration to Australia, the Chileans, Cypriots and Lebanese are grouped in a very small box and referred to or categorised as displaced persons. This led to my core research question: does poetry add value to the archival gaps? Does it clarify the assumptions of categorisation? Or, at the least, does it amplify the records of Cypriot Greek diasporic existence? Before contemplating this question, I needed to unravel the Cypriot from the Greek, the Cypriot from the Turk, the Cypriot from the British, the Cypriot from the Australian, all the various hyphenated identities of being Cypriot, in order to understand a term used by various academics and scholars, Cypriotness. A basic definition of Cypriotness is the quality or characteristic of being Cypriot. Another perception of Cypriotness comes from an intensive study of literature by people who identify as Cypriot, that is, people born in Cyprus or descendants of Cypriots. As Lyssiotis Zafiriou, philologist and poet, states in his paper titled About the Term Cypriot Literature, in Hellenic Studies, Volume 15, 2007, this is what he writes: by considering that the term Cypriot literature is misleading and any attachment to it inevitably leads to a separatist approach of literature and by extension to national division, then we are merely fighting with shadows and no problem can thus be resolved. The term Cypriot literature is far more explicit, and at the same time its long-term use adequately covers local and regional literature and justifies its grammatological use. The historic and political events of 1974, with their tragic consequences, did not alter the character of this literary making. Just as in previous years, the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus in 1960 did not lead to its national ghettoisation. This quote by Zafiriou alerts us to perhaps an incorporation of many diverse identities and influences which inform the output of creative writing by people who have inherited the wounded memories of Cyprus. In particular, it is the poetry of Zeny, Giles and P Lyssiotis that I draw from to provide that nuanced insight into Cypriotness as a form of inheritance, heritage and documentation. Since the 1980s, both Giles and Lyssiotis have amassed well-deserved awards and literary recognition for their creative output. In my interviews with each of them and a study of their works, there is something they individually and significantly offer to enhance the knowledge of what it means to be a Cypriot Greek within an Australian context. Let's begin with Zeny Giles. Born Zenobia Doratis, her father migrated from Cyprus to Australia in 1927. In 1936, through a broxenia, an arranged marriage, he married Giles's mother, who is from Kastellorizo, an island of Greece. A year later, Giles was born. Her literary accomplishments are many, including winning significant prizes for her poetry and stories, such as the Age Short Story Competition in 1981. Her book of short stories, Miracle of Waters, published by Penguin in 1989, was highly commended in the Literature and Other Writing section of the National Human Rights Awards. In 2009, she received a special mention in the Manning Clark House National Cultural Awards, given her 3 acclaimed books: Caught in the Light, an anthology of stories and poems published by Catchfire Press, 2002, Miracle of Waters, which I mentioned, and Wedding Dance. This is a novel dealing with marriage customs in the Greek Cypriot community in the 1930s, published by Coel in 2009. Her poetry books are many, including Parables, published by Al Publishing in 2017, one of my favourites. In response to my question about whether her Cypriot heritage influenced her poetry, Zeny Giles replied, "My poems have come out of my life story. It's hard to disentangle the biographical elements from the Cypriot influences. My best poem about my father, I think, is My Father's Hands, and that is dependent on his physical appearance, including his big spatula-shaped fingers. The poem was written after he had been living with us for several months near the end of his life. Greek language has its influence, especially the way my father would mix his halting English with Greek. He never went back to Cyprus and didn't seem to have happy memories of growing up there. Although after I visited Dora, a village in Cyprus, when we mentioned how beautiful the village was, he said, 'My outlook in Cronulla is not the first time I've had a good view.' So they're based in New South Wales. Although Giles draws from the personal, her poems that engage with the paternal in her life provide familiar themes, ethos and drama. In her 7-part long poem, My Father's Hands, from her poetry collection, Black Butt Honey, there is a dialogue between father and daughter. This mirrors the authoritative, opinionated and comedic Cypriot Greek man dominating many migrant households, including my father, who passed away suddenly this year. So I'll be reading excerpts from this poem, and firstly I'll begin with section 3. My father's hands harangue me. You mustn't work so hard. He points with irritation at my knitting. Even when you sit to rest, your hands keep busy. As for your husband, he never stops. His books, his lawns, his cleaning of the gutters. Hands energetic now with Greek advice. Go out, spend your money, take a trip, do it in your 60s. Don't wait till you are nearly dead like me. He shrugs his shoulders, drops his hands and sighs. I talk too much. Tell me to shut my mouth and go away. I put my knitting down and start to speak. He doesn't listen, but takes the stage again and, cocky, loud, lifts up his hand to threaten. You are my child, remember that. If you dare say bad words to me, the heria su θα δρέμουν. His grim prediction comes too late. My fate already in his hands. He passed the tremble on to me. My sin was his originally. Our smiles confirm complicity. In this poem, Zeny Giles records how the body with its tendencies and afflictions are bequeathed, how a father's arduous labour continues through his offspring despite his warning. She writes, he'd worked in cafes, his hands were made for scaling fish, not posing for photos. And then in section 4 of this poem, we come to the liminal space between life and death, the passing of the Cypriotness from father to daughter with language, cadence and juxtaposition. He has outlived them all, wife, sisters, brothers, except for brother Christos, 98 years old, still living in his Cypriot village. My father's hands are folded on his chest. His hands are still. They're practicing for death, and we must jolt him from his slumber. Dad, you have to eat. Just one more piece, just one. No more, he says. And when I bring the water to his lips, he shouts exasperated, Gori, then echo orexi. And seeing my distress, concedes, I'll get up now and walk with you, but do not make me eat. He leans against me as we walk the shiny corridor. We sit beside the salt-smeared windows and watch the hazy roll of waves and distant surfers like black seals, the sandy games of children. Your hands are cold, I say to him and rub his hands with mine. He gazes out beyond the sea and finds forgotten cadences. Bagomena daheria, zesti gardia. Familiar rhythms tease his tongue. He sucks again on paradox. The poem's focus on the father's gaze beyond the sea takes us back to Cyprus, being an island country surrounded by thalassa. This impacts the Cypriot migrant and refugee journey, which is marked by vulnerability and resilience. In this poem, Zeny Giles not only creates a poignant portrait of her father, she documents the story for many Cypriot Greeks who have lived the bulk of their remaining lives in Australia, who have consciously or unconsciously found ways to still remain Cypriot and pass that sensibility to their offspring, showing us how to live in states of paradox. There are two more poems by Zeny Giles that reveal something about her way with language and portrait poetry that are worth considering. So I'll read these straight from the book. How patiently our mother rolls the wooden pin and with her deft, cajoling hands binds fast the flour and water. Each filo, like transparent silk, lies ready to receive the mark of olive oil, amygdala, garidia and ganella. The baker's furno does its part, and mother then resumes the task of drenching crisply layered leaves with aromatic melli. At last, without a backward look, she carves her new bound gleaming book and makes each bite-sized baklava a gentle word of blessing. So obviously this is about her mother, and her mother was from Castellorizo, but there's something about the way Zeny has a very song-like quality about her work, and I think there's both a harking back to her Cypriotness and her Greekness in that poem. The next one is an interesting one because it really shows the relationship between her and her father and their discordant views. And she was speaking to me about this poem, so I will read it. Intruders. The epigram reads, Remembering Cronulla 2005. On the day of the riots, I could see my father back from the dead, wielding a righteous whip like Christ in the temple saving his paradise. He thought of Cronulla as his own, and he would take his children and grandchildren along the esplanade, point out the boundless sea, its lacy inlets, the ocean baths where he would swim and do his exercises, and he would say with thankfulness as well as pride, "This place is worth $1 million to me. No, more than $1 million." He should have had some sympathy for those Lebanese youths. He'd come from Cyprus in 1927, young and swarthy and speaking no English. He'd known alienation. But year by year his work had prospered, and his reward in retirement was to live by the coast with the ocean caught in his windows. In old age he grew suspicious. Too many Chinese, he would complain. They come here to our park every Sunday and take the best tables. So he might well have joined the call for core Australian values like Howard, Hanson, and Costello, and the many who applauded them. He found it easy to forget how recently our ships had come to someone else's paradise. I love how Giles documents the vital differences in values and philosophies between her and her father in this poem. I like also how a seashore can change from a Cypriot migrant's paradise to a contested fortress, and it provides a nuanced understanding of multiculturalism and cross-cultural relationships. In contrast, the poetry of Peter Lyssiotis relies on allegory to interpret its Cypriotness. Now, before I read his poem, it's important to note that he was born in 1949 in Larnaca. Now, some people here are very familiar. Let me know if I've got it wrong. In Larnaca, in a place called Xilondimpou, which is in Larnaca in Cyprus. He arrived in Australia with his mother at the age of 5 to join his father. As well as poetry, he is a photographer and photomonteur with a wealth of projects and publications, books, exhibitions, etc. In many of his publications, his writing and art collaborates on the page with translations in Greek or English. He collaborates a lot. There's an artist, Phrixos, he collaborates with him and many other artists. In 2004, his poetry book, The Bird, the Bell Tower, published by Modern Writing Press and later a bilingual edition by Owl Publishing, was highly commended in the National Anne Elder Award. From Lyssiotis's rare collector's book, Birds of Byzantium, published by Master Thief in 2010, he provides us with a vision that encapsulates all that is Cyprus. The finch slipped out of the monastery and flew down to the port. There it settled on the mast of the Queen of Mercy. The ship was sailing towards a land the finch had heard of, a land which was the meeting place of exiles and dreamers, a place far away, planted with spindly parched trees, where any corner of cool shade was a miracle. The finch knew all this. It was what it wanted. I look for my homeland under different stones, and it seems no matter which way I turn, I will always land on shores where I feel myself dissolve. Cyprus is more a feeling than a solidified country for Lyssiotis and many Cypriots who left Cyprus at a young age. They left before the capital city, Nicosia, was split with the green checkpoint line, knowing that siege was imminent and that both exiles and dreamers would claim Cyprus through memory and story from a vast distance. Much later, in his 50s, Lyssiotis returns to Cyprus and stays at the St. George Mavrovouni monastery. Lyssiotis tells me that while he was at the monastery, he noticed how each monk had a distinct job, which created a complete way of existing. Whether it was cooking, painting, icons, sweeping, they knew their role. He felt he didn't know how to contribute. He asked the elder monk and was clearly told that he did have a job. It was to write. Lyssiotis did write 3 books of poetry adhering to Byzantine and traditional bookbinding, involving exquisite art, photos, font and ink drawings, a feast for the eye, as one carefully leafs the pages at the State Library of Victoria's rare book collection. I recommend you go there. The books are fantastic. You need to wear gloves. It's amazing. In his prologue, he provides insight into the omniscient lens he employs in all 3 books. He writes, "The text for Birds from Byzantium was written in 2009 at the monastery of Mavrovouni in the Larnaca district of Cyprus, where within a small space there is a cross-section of Cypriot history. The monastery was built on the ruins of a Byzantine church. There are the sounds of the monks talking, chatting, going on about their allotted tasks, and the bells and the worshippers. The monastery is cradled in the valley. On the brown hills in front of the monastery is a military checkpoint. There is razor wire, guard dogs, military vehicles, and Greek Cypriot boys with automatics barking instructions to each other. Across from these young men is a no man's land, mined, And on the opposite hills, there are Turkish Cypriot boys carrying automatics, yelling at each other behind razor wire. A white helicopter with its blue UN markings monitors the zone between the two checkpoints. This is the Green Line. Behind the monastery there is a bitumen road, and across from it there is a mine which produces the pigment umber. The story goes that Dutch painter Vermeer insisted on Cypriot umber for his shadow areas. Around the mine there is a processing plant and heavy industrial equipment. So within this small space there are three distinct zones: the military, the spiritual and the commercial, and all three span huge chunks of time. Then Lyssiotis likens this time span to the relationships we have with our fathers and mothers who bequeath us the spoken and the unspoken, the recalling and the forgetting, as he comes to rest and release what is carried from one generation to the next. As he writes, the father dies, the son holds on to 1,000 unspoken words, 100 regrets. In the place where the ancient and the new, the spiritual, the military and the commercial, death, resurrection and daily life coexist, the boundaries blur and break down. In a sense, he is enlivening us to the way that the past embodies the present, and how archival chronology cannot corral this type of emotional truth. And he is speaking to all of us carrying inherited trauma, as Maria Tamarkin in her book Axiomatic reminds us through questioning how to speak of this beforeness, how to speak of things being passed on if they are not histories and habits so much as structures of feeling. The idea that feelings are structured as if they are rooms in homes appeals to Peter Lyssiotis' following poem, which intersects with diplomacy, advocacy and peacemaking by honouring the structure of the mother tongue. I am standing on the small wooden bridge at the monastery, looking down on the drying riverbed, and there it is again. My grandmother's voice, telling me that the things I say should be round, like an O, because, she explains, if words have sharp edges, they remain where they fall and never roll out into the world. This poem is from the limited edition book Bridge, included in the rare books located at the State Library. The Elder Paints an Icon is another of these beautifully illustrated books of poetry. It is here that Lyssiotis also reminds us that as the child of Cyprus grows to elder, the emphasis on memories to restore a sense of continuum is urgent. He states, when did all this happen? And did it happen here or in another place whose name sounded the same? There are so many names. How will I know which is the right one? There are so many ghosts. How will I know which ones belong to me? I need strong arms and a back that is firm. That's why I stop in the shade of an old fig tree to rest. I know it has a great heart, a heart that is as great as its sorrow. Each time I sit in its shadow, I learn again how well fables grow on trees. It is here that he suggests that the fig tree is the Cypriot teacher of migrant storylines. By reading its trunk, branches and fruit as a storage of past, we are planted in soil mixed with all who have conquered and surrendered, colonised and settled. A focus on this type of tree is not peculiar to the writing of Lyssiotis. In The Island of Missing Trees, the recent novel by Elif Shafak about the Cyprus problem, the central character is a fig tree. It is the fig tree who watched, waited and witnessed since its Cypriot birth in 1878. Both Lyssiotis, Cypriot Greek Australian, and Shafak, Turkish British, may be unearthing the same fig tree. Despite their separate personal histories, they acknowledge this tree's contribution to the struggle and survival of Cyprus. The fig tree's fruit, both fresh and dried, so widely eaten in the Mediterranean and the Middle East that it's known as the poor man's food. The fig tree cultivated with bird netting crowning its growth. The fig tree worshipped when in need or in trouble, and through Peter Lyssiotis' following poem, showing us how to simultaneously leave and stay in Cyprus. Once again, I take the shape of the tree with me. I am where you are going, whisper the dark green winds which pass through the leaves. I will leave, but the footprints which circle the fig tree remain. Both Giles and Lyssiotis have drawn from various sources to document their sense of what it means to be Cypriot, utilising memory, oral stories, travel journals, interviews, or accessing their personal records. In doing this, they have produced another way of enhancing knowledge about a group of migrants and refugees subsumed or accounted for by the bigger groups of Hellenics, Greeks, English, Australians, and categorised only as displaced. These two poets are by no means the only Cypriot Greek Australia-based poets who have contributed to the literary and indeed the historical sphere with creative output that provides a nuanced picture of Cypriot Greek diaspora. Academics George Kanarakis, Maria Herodotou, Hellenikas, Anastasios M. Damis and N. Trakakis have collectively anthologised well over 30 first-generation and second-generation Cypriot Greek Australia-based poets, writers and authors. I have reached out to a number of these poets for previous research purposes, but for the purposes of tonight's speech, I have focused on two who were first highlighted in George Kanarakis' seminal anthology, Greek Voices in Australia, a tradition of prose, poetry and drama, published by the Australian National University Press in 1987. When it comes to signifying the separateness of literature defined as Cypriot, it's arguably rooted in the specificities of Cyprus itself. A distinct history involves a distinct memory, post-memory and possibly counter-memory, when noting the political, ideological, cultural, societal and psychological dilemma known as the Cyprus problem. It's enlightening how Zeny, Giles and Peter Lyssiotis address this issue through a relationship with family, elder and nature, an interaction of sorts in order to frame humanity with its diverse shades. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I just want to say thank you to the Greek community of Melbourne and to the Greek Australian Cultural League and for all of you being here tonight. I know how much we've got on. Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the floor?
Thank you, Angela. That was really great. Of course, I know your work, and I know Peter Lyssiotis and Zeny Giles very well. I've studied their works. And I'm really interested in that you're concentrating on the history that we get through their poetry. And that's very important to me. That's always been my when I studied all of these people, I was always thinking of what are they actually saying about their lives back home and here in Australia. And the other thing is that you're actually studying these people, and you're one of the younger ones, our generation, where we're more or less dying, to put it bluntly, because we're getting old. And unless those of you who are younger are willing to study, research and study and publish those poets, I fear for the future, but there is hope when people like you, I think it's, Angela Costi has actually done a lot. She could be just concentrating on her poetry and forget about studying other poets and put so much work into it. And also you publish in Cordites, poetry review, and so other people, non-Greeks and non-Cypriots get to learn about. So we're thankful to you, Angela. Thank you.
Look, just to take up what you just said about the thing that is a little bit disheartening is that we're all nodding and we're aware of them, but a lot of the younger generation that are studying creative writing, and I may be wrong, Tina's in the room, but you know, a lot of the younger generation aren't aware of even Peter Lyssiotis. And that's sort of probably one of the reasons why I'm doing it. You know, I came across George Kanarakis' book ages ago and realised that, you know, people have come before that have done a lot of amazing work, and I think you need to be aware of that. You need to do your reading and your research. You're not in a vacuum. It's not just all about you in this space as a poet, which we tend to have healthy egos, but I think that there are many incredible people that have come before us. I connected with Zeny Giles' work as soon as I started studying her work, and there's a lot. There's so much that she's done. She's prolific, but she's not studied, you know, at all.
Tina, anything to add as your name was mentioned?
I could just duck that, you know. Look, it's an interesting observation you make about people not knowing these writers like Peter Lyssiotis and Zeny Giles, but it's not unique to them. There are a lot of writers and poets who simply fall out of the domain due to changing literary tastes and so forth. But it is up to the academy, it's up to anthologists, publishers to keep these sorts of writers alive in the memory, which brings me to a question, and that is, Kanarakis anthologised the Cypriot writers in the category of Greek.
Yes.
So I'm interested in exploring with you the question of categorisation. We have a number of categorisations. We could say Cypriot Greek, Cypriot, and then of course there is Cypriot Turkish literature, and that can be categorised itself. So in terms of that question, how do you position these writers and their relationship to the Greek language, to Greece, to the diasporic situation, and more broadly?
Yeah, well, it depends on which writers I'm studying and also what their perception is as well. But, you know, in relation to Zeny Giles and Peter Lyssiotis, the Greek hyphenated identity, I think, is very significant and important to them. Then you've got the younger writers. These are very recent anthologies, and I'm learning from the younger writers. These are people based in Cyprus, some international writers, and they would suggest that they don't ascribe to hyphenated identities. It's important for them to be known as Cypriot. And that there are many different nationalities residing in Cyprus. Now, the last time I was in Cyprus, it was 1995, 1996. It's a long time ago. Now, since then, a lot has been written about the Cypriot identity through various anthologies. So that's a question. It just really does depend on the cohort, the group, the generation. I respect George Kanarakis' work because he's also in that, he's done some also recent work as well, where what I love about it, he really does a lot of in-depth study of the backstory of each writer. And so even though that was a 1987 anthology, I was able to determine out of all of them who were the Cypriots, who had the Cypriot background. And that made a difference to my research. I can't see, I'm short-sighted, so sorry.
Thanks for your talk, Angela. It was wonderful. It's one thing to disseminate information about Greek and Cypriot poets and writers and to the wider Greek community, but how do we get these people known within the wider Australian community? What's the best way to do that? Because if we can do that, I think that these people will be better known more widely. At the moment, although it's fantastic what's being done, we're preaching to the converted. And I want to see names like Lyssiotis and others widely known worldwide. How do we do that? What's the best way to do that, in your opinion?
Oh, God. That's the, as Zeny, Giles's dad would say, that's the million-dollar question. Look, I just think it's not about, for me, for a lot of these writers, it's not really about being famous or you know, that's what you admire the most about them in some ways. Zeny Giles, you know, she doesn't promote herself. She does continue to write, and it's through her writing, and she submits like all of us. And you know, sometimes she wins an award. I mean, that's the way. Like Dimitris Tsaloumas is so well studied. And when I spoke to the non-Greek friends that I've got about Dimitris Tsaloumas, they're all nodding their heads. They nod their heads when it comes to Dimitris Tsaloumas, they're aware of him, Antigone Kefala, and then, yeah, not aware of a lot of the other writers. I don't know. That's a really hard question. I think you just have to keep going at it, publishing, researching, promoting their work, trying to get them, submitting your work to festivals that are part of the wider community. So if there is, you know, a wider community festival like the Melbourne Writers' Festival, you know, being brave enough to pitch what you want to do to them.
On that same question, I think we have a problem in how we think about literature here in Australia. We try to have, excuse me, we try to have some sort of connection with our roots. So most institutions and schools would teach Seferi and Rizzo, but not anyone from here. And I think we came now to a stage where we have to make an effort to promote our own literature here, which is an Australian literature, with our Greek as part of it at the end. Lyssiotis doesn't want to go out and promote himself, but most of our institutions promote the person who wants to promote himself or herself at the end. And we don't know of anyone else. So the curriculum of Greek schools, what do they teach? I was saying when we had the Kefala lecture to Kathy, that have we gone to book fairs here in Australia and said, hey, we have Saloma, we have, you know, Lyssiotis, we have whoever we have at the end, and promote their books. From our institutions, from our organizations, that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
University degrees in Greek, do they teach local literature? Again, we have to change our paradigm. It's very important to stick and hold on to Rizos and Seferis, but it's very important to also have a look at what Lyssiotis and Giles have to say.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think it would be wonderful to have in the curriculum a section that is dedicated to local authors. Yeah.
Oh, hi.
Hi. I can't see you down there, but thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to say, make a few corrections. One, the green line is a line that the English drew in 63, and it's only in a certain part of Nicosia. The rest of the Attila line along the whole of Cyprus was drawn in 74. Okay, so it's not only a particular part of Nicosia, which is green line. The rest is the Attila line, and of course it's not called They're not called borders because we're not bordering with a legal country. They are called roadblocks.
Thank you for that.
Just so you know.
Yep. But I was quoting Peter's work, so...
Fair enough. He possibly didn't know. I'm just...
Yeah,
you know,
thank you.
Yeah, and also, can I finish? Thank you. Yeah, okay. Mavrovouni. That's how it's pronounced.
Okay.
Mavrovouni. Mavrovuno. Okay. The third thing I want to point out is the issue of certain people identifying supposedly as Cypriot. I want to know if these people are not Greek in any way, why do they speak Greek? Why do they write in Greek? And how can you actually erase the history of an island that has been Greek for 4,000 years in the last 30 or 40 years because it's very fashionable and the English would love to do that because it's in their interest.
Yeah, that's a very...
Cyprus is an island that was not allowed to unite with Greece because it is of strategic importance to the English. And they made it clear that even, you know, no matter what we did, they would never allow that to happen, okay? They're trying to de-Hellenize the island. Of course, there are some fools and some idiots who say things like that, but that's rather dangerous because my ID says Κυπριακή υπηκότητα αλλά ελληνική ηθαγένεια εθνότητα. So I am Greek and I was brought up in Cyprus as a Greek. And now I find all that very dangerous. Okay, for our existence and for the continuation of Hellenism on the island.
But I don't think what I'm saying is denying the Greek in the Cypriot, nor if there was a Cypriot Turk here tonight, I wouldn't deny the Turkish in them. What I'm interested in is with these particular, taking a literary journey here, with these particular poets and writers, what is it about them that may be Cypriot? What is it about them that is interesting? That has that Cypriot quality without denying the other identity that they may have. And I mean, even Zeny Giles' work, I mean, it's very Greek. There's a lot of Greek there. I have looked and researched other poets as well, and looked at their writing, and particularly the Cypriot Greeks. There's a lot of connection with, you know, the Greekness as well. The boundaries are very blurred. So I'm not suggesting it. I'm not trying to be very political here because it's a vexed issue.
So, Angela, I was really struck by a line that you said. I'm not sure whether you were, this is something you were saying, or you were saying it in terms of something that Peter Lyssiotis said, and it was I think the chronology of archives versus the sort of, I don't know, holistic, emotional, baggage reality of having a Cypriot background, for instance. And I just thought it was really interesting because if you go to a museum or whatever, you get a neat timeline and events and and there's just so much nuance in between, so many different layers of human experiences. Just something that happened very recently. This sort of older guy was helping George and I with a wheelchair. And he had what looked like those worry beads with him, so I just, on a spur of a moment, asked him, you know, if he was Greek. And he said he was actually a Turkish Cypriot, and when he heard that George was Greek, he came over and spoke to him in Greek and wanted to know if he's, if he's from Cyprus or whatever. So I just thought it was just really interesting how these two poets, the importance of the different poets adding their voices and their own personal background and their personal stories as to what So as we sort of go into the next year, when we'll be talking probably, a lot more about Cyprus and all that happened, I think that's just really important that we hear these different voices. That's all. Thank you for doing this, Angela.
Thank you. In terms of you picking up that line, I think what is interesting about the way that Peter writes is he collapses all of the history into an observation, and poetry does that. It doesn't have a chronology often. It doesn't abide to historical references necessarily, even though it could be it could be based on research, based on experience, based on a travel journal. You can do some interesting, creative, collapses of time and space, and embellish and all sorts of things because it's literary. Yeah.
I have been all through this lecture fascinated by that map until I eventually worked out that it was sort of facing the wrong way and kind of worked out where Cyprus is, and off I went searching for the Peloponnese and so forth. I just wanted to say that I thought it was a very rich lecture, and I did have a question which is generationally, Zeny, Giles and Peter Lyssiotis are not a one-to-one equivalence. So I'm wondering aesthetically, apart from the obvious thing of being Cypriot Greek writers, so forth, what aesthetically drew you to put them together? Yeah.
Yes, they are a one born in the 1930s, one born in the late 1940s. Aesthetically, I found that the thing that I was really liked to explore with both of them is that they've been writing for a very long time. So I found that fascinating, and that there was a rich resource of so many poems and stories, and it's shelves of books for both of them. So I found that interesting, and I also could connect on a personal level with their output, with their creative output. I felt like there was inroads for me to speak and understand what they were doing. So, if that makes sense aesthetically,
yes,
yeah.
And I would like to make the observation to George over there that Peter is quite well known within the broader Australian context. He takes part in art book fairs and is quite respected for his work, and so is Zeny Giles known amongst an older generation of writers. It goes back to that earlier thing we said about keeping memories alive and writers alive.
Yeah.
But thank you for a very beautiful lecture.
Thank you. And there were younger, of course, there are younger poets. I contacted, I'm not joking, there are at least over 30 Australia-based Cypriot Greek poets, and you would know, many of you would know people, and people that are refugees as well, and people that are born here that feel very connected to their parents' understanding of what Cyprus is. But it's an incredible diversity as well in this space. So anyway, we'll see what happens, whether further research can be done.